Okay, everybody, so it is 1:30. I will get started. There might still be a few people who join us, but that's okay. I want to thank everybody for coming and joining this working session. My name is Melaak Rashid. I am here today doing the working session, Amplifying Diverse Communities, Enhancing Cultural Competency and Community Development for the Ohio CDC Association Conference. I'm very excited to be here, and I thank everyone for joining me today in this conference. The session itself revolves around the topic of cultural competency. We have a growing, diverse community, the demand for assistance in multilingual resources and being able to connect with residents in the communities you serve that are very diverse is growing every year. So this session will highlight some different topics in regards to how do we address these growing needs in the communities we serve. It'll give some examples. You'll get to interact with one another and brainstorm some ideas with a few breakout sessions and a few chat storms we have set up in this session. And it'll help really engage us all in how do we really make sure that we assist those in the neighborhoods we serve the way that they would respond best to make sure that we really respect the diverse communities that we serve and that we are in. We're going to do our best today to minimize any technical difficulties. I do apologize in advance if there's some mishaps on my part. In the era of Zoom and virtual learning and sessions, there sometimes comes up some technical difficulties, so I apologize in advance for that. I wanted to go over some rules to start the session off. Just so everyone is aware, this session is being recorded. You will be able to access this session at a later date once it is completed. There will be a Dropbox link that will be posted in the chat. If you can refer to the chat to see the Dropbox link that has any materials I've made available, there is a resource sheet I made available in the chat that will soon pop up. If you'd like to leave your camera off, that's great. You could leave your camera off, but I encourage you when we see and we announce that there's any breakout sessions to turn on your camera if you feel comfortable, to just have a little bit more increased engagement. Closed captioning can be accessed by clicking Alt or L at the top left of your screen. It'll open up a separate window, so if you are interested and need that resource, it is available to you. We have everyone muted so we can eliminate any background noise, and this way you can all hear the session clearly and follow along properly. Also in the Dropbox link should be a copy of the PowerPoint that we will be using in the session today, so you can follow along as well. The chat is being monitored by our host questions, and they will be accepting questions that you have throughout the presentation. Questions will have a portion to be addressed at the end of the session, but feel free to drop your questions into the chat box and they will be able to add it into the Dropbox so we can address them later. And I wanted to make sure that we also note that if you have any private questions to anyone in specific, you can feel free to message someone privately as well. And finally, be sure to visit the exhibitor space to check out all the sponsors for this year's annual conference. The link is in the chat, and I greatly thank all the sponsors for this year's Ohio CDC Association annual conference. So I'm very excited. So I'm going to get started just 1 second. All right. Okay. So again, for those who are just joining us, my name is Melaak Rashid. I am a community and outreach and director of development for Smart Development in Cleveland, Ohio. I also am an independent consultant for cultural competency and organizational behavioral and development. I also do grant writing, and I've been working in this space for about 7 to 8 years. Amplifying diverse communities, enhancing cultural competency and community development means a lot to me, and I am grateful for the Ohio CDC Association for allowing me to speak to you all today about this topic. So to get started, this is one of the first aspects that we're going to jump into. Please use the chat to brainstorm and share your responses to this question. So this question posed that many organizations may face. Laura, an immigrant from Venezuela, walks into a community development corporation's offices, seeking help to resolve an issue she's having with her landlord and inability to understand why her water bill is so high. Her native language is Spanish, and her ability to understand English is pretty low. Laura comes to the offices with her 2 children, her 2 sons, and is pleading for someone to offer her assistance to understand her situation, as it is the 3rd place that she's tried to seek some help from. What would you do if you were presented with a situation and Laura came to you seeking help? Please share your answers in the chat as we go along, and we can kind of see what each other's thinking throughout the chat with regards to this question. Whoops, I apologize. So we want to start off with what I found with CROSS is the most comprehensive definition of what cultural competence means. In practice, it's a framework for viewing our work through a culturally sensitive and unbiased lens. It's a process that evolves over time as individuals and organizations increase their level of awareness, knowledge, skills, through continued self-assessment, cultural awareness, and adapt their work according to this increasing knowledge that they obtain. When you think about culture in itself separately, culture is composed of traditional ideas, customs, and related values. It is a learned and shared and transmitted behavior from one generation to the next. It organizes life and helps interpret someone's existence. So for the most part, culture really shapes who we are as individuals and what someone brings to the table, to their community, in regards to their culture, really helps shapes us as the professionals in the community development space to really understand how we need to serve them best in the community. When you think about cultural competence and cultural competency, it's a journey and not a destination. It's not a one-stop shop and you've fulfilled every need. It's a constantly evolving journey as well. Our understanding with how to enact cultural competence in a practice has also grown to include the idea that cultural competence exists on a continuum. So it's not just one stop as mentioned, it grows continuously on a continuum. And each step along the process has a different level of understanding and something new that is learned. So if you look at it in regards to starting off from the top, cultural destructiveness, and going from the bottom, the very end, where you reach the level of proficiency, cultural proficiency that's required to serve your community best. Cultural destructiveness, which causes intentional harm to an individual within a specific culture, to cultural proficiency, which strives for deliberate inclusiveness and responsiveness to that culture's needs. And we, as the staff or the organization, are offering this assistance in the proper manner. So when we think about the continuum that's presented in front of you, adapted from CROSS, it starts off with cultural destructiveness. As mentioned, it's intentional harm, intentional attitudes, policies, and practices that do not necessarily assist the individual, but it actually is destructive to their culture and destructive to the individual themselves. When you think about cultural incapacity, this overviews a lack of capacity to help a person from a different cultural group due to biases that we build in ourselves, as well as anything outside of what we consider the mainstream culture that we are used to as individuals. Cultural blindness, once you reach that level, it's maintaining the dominant culture's approach to what we believe is the best way to respect and also acknowledge other cultures. This in a way ignores the strengths that other cultures bring and also encourages assimilation rather than celebrating the diversity we each bring to our shared culture as the community that we serve. Cultural precompetence incorporates culturally relevant information. It has different welcoming imagery. When you walk into an office, you might see some pictures of diverse colors, diverse individuals, pictures that celebrate different cultures and different racial and ethnic backgrounds. It employs people who represent the people that are intended to being served, which is a step forward into being the closest to cultural competency. When you reach the level of cultural competence, it means that you've not only accepted, but you're also respecting the differences that are continuing to evolve in the community that you're serving. You are also encouraging yourself to continuously give yourself self-assessment and expanding of your knowledge to make sure that those that you're serving are being heard properly. The highest level that you could reach is cultural proficiency, and this is deliberate inclusiveness and regular assessment of responsive to the cultural needs of the staff and the people you serve. You've achieved every level in regards to how well you can incorporate the differences in the community you serve, and it's a continuous spectrum to make sure that you enhance that. Cultural competence, when you look at yourself as an individual compared to your position in your organization, for individuals, you most likely reach different aspects, and it has different levels for you. For an individual, cultural competency begins with cultural humility. This means that we are able to admit that we interpret events through our own lens. We interpret a culture based on our own lens as well. The norms of thinking and feeling and behaving are also shaped by our own lens on a group of people. We have to remember that people from another culture have a completely different interpretation of a given situation and different historical events. So what we ourselves deem as normal may to another individual from a different cultural background or a different experience may be not normal. So we have to understand that different lenses are different for each individual culture, and sometimes they do not overlap with what our own experiences. Recognizing our own natural tendency to see our cultural-based interpretations as right, even though they represent a set of options among us, is very clear. We have to make sure that we step aside from that natural tendency to see these different interpretations of cultures the way we see them fit. Not always do we know what cultures are among us. We have to explore in our neighborhoods what exists and what different values and representations are we actually serving that we may not be aware of. Seeking out alternate interpretations as we interact with diverse individuals and making decisions to solve the problem is very big. We have to make sure that we're constantly trying to solve the problem to make sure that all different individuals of different ways of life can be able to feel comfortable with us as we continue this journey to understand how do we properly represent them and serve them. For an organization, even when we aspire to be culturally competent as individuals, the systems in place with the organizations we work with may keep us from putting this in place. Sometimes this means that institutional policies are keeping us from doing this on the organization level. Sometimes it might be policies just on the staff level, or also among your colleagues. Your colleagues may not be making it a shared space to be able to grow together to reach that cultural competency level you aspire to reach on your organizational level. Cultural competence at the organizational level requires organizations to constantly and consciously design structures and settings to meet the diverse stakeholders. So it's with conscious, but also on a consistent basis, share and bounce ideas and work towards this aspect to make sure that they're meeting the needs of the diverse stakeholders that they serve, but then that they also are making sure that it's ever evolving. As we see historically, our neighborhoods are shifting. What once used to be the majority demographic in our neighborhoods 10 years ago is not what it is now. So this is going to be a breakout session. We are going to have this breakout discussion be about 5 minutes. So you'll have 5 minutes to talk with the individuals in your breakout session. And this is something I'd like for you guys to brainstorm about. So Alia and Sarah, both visibly Muslim, enrolled in a higher local program offered by the local CDC in their neighborhood. They informed the program manager that due to their religious reasons, they prefer working in an environment that does not serve alcohol. The program manager connects them with a local restaurant that requires service to serve alcohol. Finding no cultural cues or connections and no sense of opportunity due to the first employment option presented to them, Sarah and Alia drop out of the program. As the program manager's supervisor, what would you do to guide your staff to make sure to see how they could help the girls who left the program? Go over this with your group. Welcome back, everybody. Slowly, I know I see participants are joining back the main session outside of their breakout rooms. So I hope within those 5 minutes, you were able to discuss some great ideas with those in your breakout session. We're still having some people join back from their breakout room. What I'd like for those of you who have joined us back already is to share your thoughts on this breakout session question about what would you do as the program manager supervisor to guide your staff with the girls who left the program or any future situations. So whatever you discussed in your breakout room, if you could share in the chat to discuss and kind of, highlight some of the aspects that you see fitting for the situation that you reviewed in your breakout group. So for those that are now fully back, to remind everyone, if you could just share in the chat what you discussed in your breakout group. This way we can start to see all the diverse things and reasonings that we have for this breakout question and what would you do as the program manager supervisor in this given situation. I'd like to select one individual who feels comfortable sharing what they would do in this situation to the whole group. If someone wants to raise their hand, they can be selected to share their response to this breakout question.
Paul Bryson.
Right. Hi, Paul. So if you could share your thoughts on what you would do that you shared with your breakout room as the program manager supervisor in this situation.
Sure. Well, we talked through a few things. One was we weren't sure whether the preferences or restrictions, however we want to term it, were tracked in our system very well. So we were worried there could be a disconnect where we weren't even seeing if there was a way for it to be communicated through to frontline staff and people actually dealing with the program. Do some training on how we connect and make sure we know what employers are in our kind of referral network or our placement network, so that we know what things are expected of people who get placed there, so that we can accommodate those to the extent possible and talk over them with the people who are in the program. It may be that some people it's a strong preference or an absolute I can't, and with other people it's just, well, if that's the only thing that's available, I can deal with it. And so making sure that we let a person tell us where their lines are. And then also make sure that if these things are already in place and they're being communicated, that we make sure that the staff doing placement get some training and know why this is so important to people, both for our program to be effective and to make sure that we don't have somebody who is undermining the efforts of our program by ignoring it if we've already got it in place.
I think that's actually some really good points. As you guys were in your breakout rooms, I kind of thought about the question myself, even after writing the question. I think one of the greatest points that you brought up that I actually initially didn't think further deep into is definitely knowing someone's hard lines. So a lot of different cultures, you said there's different spectrums as well. So even those who are in a shared cultural group, sometimes there's a broad spectrum. So whether you see someone who has a hard line now due to their religious beliefs or also a cultural standing that's maybe taboo in their own culture, but then you also have different generational differences within a specific culture where sometimes there's some flexibility. So I think that point that you made where maybe understanding where their hard lines are or what they're flexible on is definitely a great point to make sure that they can really assess the situation in the best possible and serve the demographic and for future clients as well that come from the same community. And this aspect, for them, it seemingly was a hard line potentially. And for future individuals who are also visibly Muslim women, they may have a different view, but being able to talk through that is actually a really great point that I like that you brought up. So when we think about remembering the complexities of culture, and we just touched base on this with that breakout question, culture is complex. And what individuals feel they identify with in a culture is very complex as well. There's intersecting identities in a given culture. When we think about, for example, I always come back to the feminist theory of intersectionality. It is not just, simply, used in the context within the feminist movement anymore, but it's also used in the context of overall individuals. Culture is complex and our identities are complex. It's multifaceted, multi-layered. You know, we have individuals who are, you know, hijab wearing Muslim women, but they are also part of the LGBTQ community. There's the transgender community, the African American, Black, refugee, immigrant, Latinx community. There's very multifaceted ways that shape our culture, and not always is it a one and done identity or an idea of what that shared culture is. So being able to make sure, even when it comes to social class, language, age, where someone grew up as well, someone who recently moved to, say, Cleveland, but their whole entire life experience is on the West Coast in California, in Los Angeles, their ability to adapt to the Cleveland culture is very different. So we have to understand that there's a lot of intersecting identities when we think about how do we really try to prepare our staff and our organization to do what we can to meet as many needs as possible with these complex cultures. Culture is both invisible and visible. The visible aspects includes the different and overt behaviors, for instance, how someone dresses. For in our previous example, you know, wearing the hijab is visibly a Muslim garb. What they eat, what holidays they observe, you know, most religions, it is commonly known or can be easily accessed, you know, what holidays does that specific culture or religion celebrate. Below the surface is where it gets a little bit more complex and where you do have to have more developed conversations to understand the invisible aspects within the culture. We have to also see, you know, what does this mean? How does this shape their behaviors? Cultures offer a lot of different answers to questions such as, what does it mean to be on time? There's certain cultures that have a different idea of what it means to be on time. When is it okay for someone to make direct eye contact or use gestures, touch? You know, my background is I am Arab and Latina, and using hand gestures is a big form of communication in our cultures. We also have to know that for some, it's seen as offensive, or also touch. Sometimes touching is an offensive behavior for some cultures. We see this a lot in the healthcare industry, but it's also very predominant in the nonprofit industry, especially community development. We're very hands-on with the communities we serve, and all these different factors are very critical on how they can respond best to the service we're trying to provide, but also respond to them for the services that they're looking for. Each culture has internal diversity, as we mentioned. American culture, for example, includes ethos of large cities as well as rural communities. We can also distinguish between cultures from the West Coast to East Coast with American culture and in the Midwest. Additionally, members of each culture can still demonstrate a variety of different beliefs. You have very liberal Christians, conservative Christians. You have individuals who are conservative or liberal on all spectrums, whether they're Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Hindu, and even those who are atheists. There's individuals who identify as atheists, and they have a variety of different views that represent who they are. When you come down to ethnic and cultures, you have to think about different nationalities as well in a given culture, also have a little bit of variations. So when you look at the Arab culture, there's 24 different countries that make up the Arab American community. Each culture has a little bit of a twist to something, say, in a cuisine we eat. Or you also have to think that shared culture also means there's diversity in other ways, such as religion and practice. So these different multi-layered, complex sometimes aspects to someone's culture, you also have to look at it in the aspect of those who identify as Black, who are recent immigrants or recent refugees, have a different sense of culture and experience to American culture than the Black community that has been living and was born and raised in the United States. So even then you see some differences in need and differences in communication depending on where they grew up. Cultures are very dynamic. They're also very beautiful in that way, and that's what the beauty is in having to continuously reach the idea of culture itself and understanding it, that they change over time. For example, American culture was once excluding women from voting, and they weren't serving in the army or any armed forces, and now that's no longer present today. We also see that in other countries. Things are shifting, politics are changing in other countries and those who are emigrating here. We also have to understand what someone experienced in a different culture or community also is very different to what they're experiencing now in the society and neighborhood, down to the neighborhood they live in. I live in Cleveland, so when you look at the different cultures and representation from, say, Ohio City compared to Old Brooklyn, you do see some differences, and a lot of individuals see them as well. With cultural competency, there's no entry by default. People of color, for instance, might still cling to stereotypes about members of, say, the gay LGBTQ community. They may cling to even stereotypes about the American culture. So when you meet somebody who grew up in a different country and they've emigrated to the United States, they may even cling to stereotypes about American culture and American society that really isn't true. Stereotypes that need to be broken down, and that can be assisted by breaking it down with the help of our community development corporations and with their ability to break down these complex issues and really get them to understand that these are stereotypes. It also is in reverse for other instances that we see today. So this is very prevalent today, that there's a lot of stereotypes and a lot of situations where people are unaware that what they're thinking is really not true, but they need some assistance to walk through it. What is the difference with the different concepts that we see with cultural awareness, cultural knowledge, cultural sensitivity, and cultural competence? When you think about cultural knowledge, this means that you know some aspects of a culture's characteristics, their values, their history. You may know or had some experiences with some of their behaviors, and you may have been experienced or exposed at least to what their language sounds like. So when you think about language as well, that's a part of someone's culture for many different groups, and maybe you've heard what that language may sound like. That's aspects of cultural knowledge that can be a great attribute and partner when you're developing cultural competency policies in your organization, and also can bring some bits and pieces for some shared understanding to those who may not have had that knowledge or exposure that you have. When you think about cultural awareness, it's the next stage in understanding another group, being more open. You're at this stage, you're wanting to break down even your own biases that you may have. So you're just a little bit more open to the changing cultural attitudes that you have, as well as the community you serve. You know, what role do you play in wanting to change the cultural attitudes that exist in your community to help make a more cohesive, unified community with the diversity that it has? You know, everything we know about a culture may not always be right. So at this point, cultural awareness, you may have corrected the instances that you don't know when you were in the cultural knowledge phase. Cultural sensitivity is knowing the differences that exist between cultures and not assigning values to the different cultures, whether they're right or wrong or better or worse, that you know that they each have their own unique factors about them. Clashes on this point can easily occur. Sometimes you may not yet know what cultural clashes exist between the different cultures, especially if there's a custom or belief in question that goes against the idea of multiculturalism itself. There's a lot of internal conflict when you reach the cultural sensitivity phase, because it may conflict with what you believe or what you may have known at one point. There's a lot of different multifaceted layers once you reach this point on an interpersonal level, and on an organizational level that you may have not been able to be exposed to yet. It's likely to occur over time as you're in this phase. Conflicts won't be able to be easily managed, especially when you're in a workplace or in a neighborhood that also may not be at the same level of cultural competence or sensitivity that you're at. It's a journey, as we mentioned before. It's on a spectrum, and you also have to be able and willing to uplift somebody on that journey. And this also includes individuals of that specific culture. Sometimes it's very easy to be in what we call bubbles of our own comfort zones. We do often see bubbles of the Muslim community in one area, the Latinx community in another. We see the Black community, the Indian community, the overall South Asian community or Eastern Asian community. We have these sub bubbles we see in our communities because it's their comfort zone. So we can't necessarily understand and reach the cultural sensitivity phase where are knowing the differences between the two unless they also contribute to multiculturalism themselves. There's a lot of times factors that make these different cultures feel unsafe, and is not necessarily something that that particular neighborhood gave them, but it's also down to stereotypes. There's a lot of different instances that make someone shapes their experiences, and they might be scared, whether it's to backlash, they're scared of being subject to cultural insensitivity experiences, racism as well. There's a lot of different factors that make someone scared to open up to someone who's different than themselves. But as community development leaders, we have to take it upon ourselves to find ways to break these bubbles, to break these have these shared experiences amongst each other and be able to identify how we can use this to our advantage. When we think about the cultural competency at its core level, this brings together all the previously mentioned 4 levels. This all comes together and it adds to the operational effectiveness of our organization. So we've been able to incorporate these levels all together on an organizational level so we can go out and be stewards to the community and get this done together. A culturally competent organization has the capacity to bring into a system of different behaviors, attitudes, and policies that try and work together and work effectively together for these cross-cultural needs that we need to meet and produce the better outcomes we need not only on the organization level, but when we send our staff and our colleagues to go out in the community as stewards, they also have the confidence from what they have inside the organization to be able to take it outside. Oftentimes we think of the United States, or just as a common phrase, that we think of this world is like a tossed salad. Everyone's mixed in with another. Everything's, that's how we think about when it comes to the melting pot. And that's the common phrase we hear about. This nation is a melting pot, our neighborhoods are a melting pot. But that sometimes is not always the best approach when you try and think about how to be culturally competent as an organization. When you think about how that works, it plays a factor in assimilation. So you don't want necessarily someone to completely assimilate and lose who they are, or else how else will we learn and serve those we're intended to learn from? We want to make sure that we think of it, and I look at it as a garden salad. There's really important pieces in a garden salad: the tomatoes, the lettuce, the cheese, the dressing, onions, whatever other unique factors you put in your garden salads, a crouton. Each play a critical role in what is the overall garden salad. And they work together. They find a way to work together to make the salad whole. But we still admire them for what they are individually. So they are individuals, but when you look at it in a community sense, everyone brings a unique piece and an important factor. That's very important. When you think about how this works on a stepping scale basis, when you think about steps to building cultural competent organizations, you have to first start on an individual and organizational level, because if you don't achieve this on an individual level, it will be difficult for you to bring it to your organization and work collectively as a group. You have to think about having cultural humility, confronting the biases that you believe you have. You have to think about being able to let go of the stereotypes that you used to have, that you used to think potentially were right. Cultural curiosity is, in my thoughts, in my experience, one of the most important factors. Cultural curiosity will help get you to be able to confront those stereotypes to then be able to dismantle them. And once you're able to potentially dismantle them by having enough curiosity to meet diverse individuals in your community, to incorporate the diverse individuals in your organization, to be able to build the cultural competence you're looking to seek, that's activating your cultural education in every aspect that you could do, whether it's an individual organization itself. Collecting data is very important. Oftentimes in our grant making, we do research and we collect data on who we serve, sometimes just in numbers, but a lot of organizations also collect demographic data. Do we collect enough diverse demographic data, or do we have it just in the broken down bubbles that say exist on the census? So when you look at the census, for example, it's not as diverse as it is that makes up the beauty in our country. And there's a lot of different people who identify outside of the bubbles that were presented on a government form. So is the data we're collecting cohesive enough? Is it comprehensive enough? Does it actually collect enough information for me to know how many individuals of the LGBT community are in my neighborhood? How many Muslim Americans? How many refugees? How many newly nationalized individuals who are newly American citizens in my community? How many languages are spoken in my neighborhood? Sometimes these different factors we may not know, and it isn't because we're willingly leaving it out, but we may not have thought about these different things in the unique way to help meet the needs of the community we serve. Program outreach and design implementation is really critical. We need to know who we're serving, how to find them, where they are, and give them what they need. We need to figure out what portions of our neighborhood that they are, so then this way we can tap into them. Workforce diversity and competency is critical as well. You have to recognize that diversity without competency is not enough. We can't simply hire a Chinese American individual who speaks Chinese in our organization. We have to be able to incorporate them into our core policies that make the organization who we are. We can't just have pictures across our offices of, a Black family with children. We have to actually be able to know and say, and we can identify, I know how to serve that Black family and their 2 children who have different needs that I may not be aware of as being a non-Black individual. We have to be able to say these things to one another in our organizations to be able to then identify how we can serve them best, but also incorporate them better in our organization. Cost is a very big thing to our organizations. All organizations have budgets, and a lot of times they're preset. For some organizations that operate on a small budget, thinking about cost is sometimes stressful, as many organizations rely on grants or community development block grant dollars. We have to think about how can we leverage the dollars we have to commit to a cultural competent organization and include these different steps in the process of how we implement these things on an institutional level in our organization. And sometimes cost doesn't actually have to have a big penny to it. Sometimes the cost of these things is just our time. So not everything is always tied to a dollar, but we also have to be able to think about cost in a sense of our time allocation. So are we providing enough time? Are we allocating enough ability for us to be able to understand the community that we serve in the way we are supposed to? So in this session, it's going to be a group discussion. I'd like for you all to go over, and you have about, I believe in this one, another 5 minutes to go over in breakout rooms and go over, what ideas do you have to organizations to add cultural competent practices in their operations? What type of practical additions do you believe there will be? How would you be able to add it when you think about cost and time? And who would be leading these efforts? Like, who would you identify, whether it's in your organization or community, to lead these efforts? There'll be about 5 minutes, and then we will come back together as a group. All right, so I see everyone is joining us back at the main session from the group discussion. And I hope you guys were able to brainstorm some ideas off one another during this group discussion. During this, I would like you also to share in the chat talking points of what you came up with. I'd like to incorporate it in the next slide, which will really give you some ideas in regards to the questions that you were asked in your breakout sessions. So if you could please share what your thoughts were, what you shared with your members in the group. And I know it was definitely not enough time to introduce, and it was 5 minutes is definitely not enough time. So I apologize to everyone who didn't get enough time to share. But for those who were able to share, if you could, or even just now, if you think about the answers to this question, if you could share your thoughts in the chat. I want to incorporate it into my next slide, which is putting it in practice, kind of offering some suggestions and being able to bounce some of our ideas off of each other from what in theory is essentially a lot of what most individuals believe is the best way to get these practices in action. So if you could share in the chat, I can see your responses. So in this way, I can incorporate it in our next slide. So when you look at practical examples of building and institutionalizing cultural competency policies and having a culturally competent organization, one of the biggest and main steps that makes it easy for someone to do is form a committee. So whether this committee is outside of the organization and it's internal, led by a staff member, and the committee has different individuals, whether it's a committee on your part of your board, whether it's an affiliate committee that's a subcommittee of your board and that the leader is a chairperson from the board of directors or the board of trustees, or it's all three. You can have a committee on the organizational level that the staff oversees and incorporates in their operations and gets feedback from, and you also have a subcommittee on your board. That is to the core of what you could start. And forming the committee is essentially the heart of all the different aspects that you see on the diagram in the PowerPoint. So you see the first one that is a lot of times a very difficult one, especially on an organizational level, is bridging language barriers. So bridging language barriers oftentimes is one of the largest reasons why some ethnic populations are not necessarily served in the best way that even the organization hopes to or wishes they could serve because of that language barrier. Bridging the language barriers can start by including individuals who have that shared language experience with the individuals who live in the community who speak that language. So if in your community you have Spanish is a predominantly spoken language in your neighborhood and you don't necessarily have a staff person that speaks Spanish at the time, you can have someone at least on your committee. So identifying a community leader from that language group to be part of that committee is key. It can also help make sure that they can create materials at minimal cost to your organization in these different languages. So this way you can also tap into those individuals who speak a different language, but also you don't necessarily have to put too much cost by hiring an interpreter. Cross collaboration is key. We often see a lot of times in the communities that we serve, there are also other small, they're small, mid-sized, and sometimes even large organizations that serve a specific special demographics, whether their main focus is to serve the Latino community, whether their main focus is to serve the Muslim community. For example, in Cleveland, there's the Spanish American Committee that I work with, and they predominantly serve the Latino and Hispanic community. Most states have individuals who are part of an organization called CARE on Islamic American Relations. They have local chapters and they serve the Muslim community. So maybe you cross collaborate with organizations that they emphasize. In Cleveland, we recently, I believe it was in the last year, have the LGBTQ community center built in the Detroit Sherway neighborhood in Gordon Square. And cross collaboration is key. You may not know yourself or not have the capacity internally to hire staff individuals who represent these diverse groups, but if you cross collaborate and build partnerships, that is a good stepping stone to building that bridge. Having cultural comprehensive assessments, similar as we mentioned, having more diverse information that you track on your intake forms. Staff development and programming is critical. If you could try and hire more diverse individuals of different backgrounds, if your budget allows it, is really key. Similar to what Miriam said, right now you can't always recruit more diverse staff. Sometimes the talent pool may not be there, but uplifting the individuals in different leadership capacities, even if they're just a community resident leader, can help build that experience to get the more professional background and experience that they may need. Recruitment outreach is critical. That goes back to cross collaboration and bridging the language barriers. You can end up getting different resources in different languages that your services and programs can outreach all these individuals. And I apologize, Miriam, if I didn't exactly make that clear. So I apologize for that. Yeah, so sometimes you can't always wait to hire them, but you need to make these different changes in your operating procedures. So sometimes you need to change them and then to make more time for that. Sometimes forming the committee is the first step when you can't hire and you can't wait and you need to address these needs now. A lot of these different barriers all lead to the organizational structure and operating procedures in different ways. So there's no one and done way to do this. You don't necessarily need to do one before you do the other. Whatever your organization capacity-wise your needs are, what you can meet and what also you could do in the now is the best thing you could do when it comes to trying to be a more culturally competent organization. So resources and costs sometimes can be much so a burden on organizations that operate on a small scale, but these different aspects, there's no way to do it. There's no order. It's just incorporating it is definitely something to start with and using what you can. So I wanted to jump into the question portion because we only do have about 5 minutes left. And I apologize for talking so much more than I anticipated on some slides. The first question came from Miriam, and her question was, are these ongoing resources you recommend for increasing cultural awareness, like the points around definitions of on time or on eye contact? This is a yes, completely across the board. Oftentimes, for example, we've seen, and we see this a lot, especially with COVID, the healthcare system does not necessarily always have the best cultural competency when it comes to how do they serve and meet the needs of the health needs of the community that they're serving that is diverse. So we often hear a lot of times that Black women are not listened to by their physicians. And there's different reasons for that go beyond the surface that a lot of the CDCs can, or even the health officials can ultimately address in the now. But if you know that a certain culture, as you're going through the different steps of cultural awareness and reaching cultural competence, you know that, for example, in the Buddhist community, touching somebody is not necessarily a good form of communication. In the Muslim community, there are some women who may not like handshaking with men. There's some women who are very flexible on that. So understanding and going back to, I believe, what Paul had mentioned earlier, is understanding the hard lines for individuals when you can. The next question I saw from Emily is, do you have a good resource for a comprehensive cultural competence assessment? I do. I don't know if it's included, if I'm not mistaken, it's included in the resource list that's in the Dropbox so you can have access to. I have a full page of different links to different resources on how to aid in the journey, the continuous journey for reaching cultural competency. I could also send out additional resources later if Ohio CDC Association allows me to, with regards to a sample intake sheet on how you can capture the very different cultural and demographic, the diversity in the demographic you serve. I also have another question. Some of the concrete examples are seen in this diagram. Again, there's no one step done all. And the reason why I know some people had mentioned about the salad example I gave, I myself, I come from the Arab and Latin community. My parents, I'm first generation American, so a lot of my cultural values are also passed down from my family. There are a lot of different diversities amongst myself when I meet other Latina women or men, or Latino men or Arab men or women, and we have different diversifying thoughts on different things. We also bring these unique factors, and that's why the salad example is more fitting for me. Assimilation was always something I grew up in, and oftentimes when you think about assimilation, people lose or are expected to forego very concrete pieces of themselves from the culture that they come from. So when you think about it in a garden salad aspect, rather than just a melting pot, it values the person as who they are as a whole, but in the aspect of coming together completely. So I wanted to go over that, and if there's any more questions that come up, we have just a few minutes. I can answer about one or two more if there is any. But I really thank you all for joining me today. I know that this may not have gone completely exactly how I wanted to, since we're all virtual, but I'm really thankful that you're all here. And since we're getting close to the end, I wanted to again refer you to the Dropbox. If there's any additional resources and there's any need to reach out to me, I could make myself available to be able to offer more insight on an applicable level for you to incorporate in your organizations. There's today at 4:30, there is another portion that you should be join that is a cooking session, and it is led by I apologize, I have to look at my notes, Mia and Ro McGee, and they are best known from Six Little McGee's, the show. So if you would like to tune in at 4:30 for the Celebrate Local Cooking class, that'll be at 4:30. And tomorrow, the second day of the Ohio CDC Association, we have our main speaker, or one of our main speakers, Chef Marcus Samuelson. He's most notably known from the Cooking Channel. He will be speaking tomorrow. And I thank you all for joining me on this session. I apologize for any clusters of words I had, and I thank you for joining me on this journey on how to appreciate and build a more cultural competent organization. I thank you all very much, and everyone in the chat who offered a lot of insight, even for myself. And as I mentioned, this is a journey. Even for myself as an individual who leads a lot of these efforts, a lot of it is working groups, and I encourage you to have working groups and hopefully find ways to incorporate some of the mentioned examples we gave today in your organization. Thank you all so much for joining today.